By the final months of 1944, the German war machine, once admired and feared for its precision, speed, and ruthless efficiency, was grinding itself into ruin. What had begun 5 years earlier as a war of rapid conquest had ended in a desperate struggle for survival, fought not on distant foreign fields, but on the shattered approaches to Germany itself. The illusion of control was gone, the initiative had slipped away, and with it, the last realistic hope of victory. Yet within the halls of power in Berlin, a dangerous fantasy still ruled. Orders continued to flow outward, rigid, uncompromising, and detached from reality. Entire armies were commanded to stand fast, to hold ground that could no longer be held, to fight battles that served no strategic purpose except to delay the inevitable. And as these orders were obeyed, the cost was measured not in kilometers lost, but in divisions erased from existence. On the Eastern Front, the scale of collapse was staggering. Soviet forces, hardened by years of brutal warfare, advanced in massive, coordinated offensives that crushed German positions one after another. Entire sectors disintegrated under the weight of overwhelming firepower and manpower. German units retreated across frozen rivers, burned out villages, and cratered roads, pursued relentlessly by an enemy that no longer feared them. What had once been a disciplined withdrawal increasingly became a chaotic flight. Behind the front lines, the situation was no better. Rail networks lay in ruins under relentless Allied bombing. Supply depots were empty or destroyed. Replacement troops arrived with little training and less equipment. Officers found themselves commanding formations that existed only on paper, divisions reduced to the strength of battalions, battalions reduced to scattered companies. And still, the orders came, hold at all costs. In towns and forests along the Vistula and later the Oder, German soldiers fought battles they knew they could not win. Ammunition was hoarded, artillery fire was rationed to a few desperate barrages. Infantry units relied increasingly on close-quarter combat grenades, submachine guns, and bare endurance to slow the Soviet advance. Entire regiments were sacrificed to buy hours, sometimes minutes, of time. When the lines finally broke, they did so catastrophically. Even Germany's elite formations were no longer decisive. The Waffen-SS divisions, once touted as the ideological and military vanguard of the Reich, were rushed from one collapsing sector to another. They fought with determination, often fanatically so, but they lacked the numbers, fuel, and air support that had once made them formidable. Their losses mounted rapidly, and replacements, if they arrived at all, were poorly trained and ill-equipped. What made the situation truly tragic was that many of the soldiers on the front lines understood the reality of their position. Veterans who had marched through France in 1940 or stood at the gates of Moscow in 1941 could see the contrast clearly. The enemy now possessed overwhelming superiority in tanks, artillery, aircraft, and logistics. Germany, by contrast, was bleeding itself dry, trading experienced men for time that no longer mattered. And yet, the machinery of command refused to adapt. Retreats were forbidden, tactical flexibility was punished as defeatism. Officers who attempted to withdraw their units to avoid encirclement were dismissed, arrested, or worse. The result was predictable. Entire formations were cut off and destroyed, not because they fought poorly, but because they were denied the freedom to survive. As the Red Army closed in, German civilians began to feel the war in ways they never had before. Refugees clogged the roads, fleeing westward in freezing temperatures, carrying what little they could salvage from their homes. Cities that had once supported the war effort now became battlegrounds themselves. The distinction between front line and rear area dissolved completely. This was no longer a war of ideology or ambition. It had become a grim test of endurance, one that Germany was losing. Each passing week brought fewer resources, fewer trained soldiers, and fewer options. The strategic picture was beyond recovery, even if no one in Berlin dared to say it aloud. If you're finding this account compelling so far, take a moment to click the subscribe button and like the video. It helps ensure stories like this told with depth and historical care reach more people who want to understand how history truly unfolded. And still, the pressure was not confined to the East. In the West, Allied armies pushed steadily toward the German border, grinding down resistance through superior logistics and overwhelming air power. Germany now faced the nightmare scenario it had once sought to impose on others: a two-front war with no reserves left to commit. By late 1944, the Reich stood on the brink not because its soldiers lacked courage or discipline, but because the system commanding them had consumed its own strength. The question was no longer whether Germany would lose the war, but how much destruction would occur before the end finally arrived. And even as the front lines collapsed and reality closed in, a final, reckless decision was already taking shape, one that would gamble everything Germany had left on a single throw of the dice. By late 1944, the collapse of Germany's war effort could be measured not only in shattered divisions or lost territory, but in something far more mundane and far more decisive: fuel. Without it, the once-feared Wehrmacht was becoming a hollow force, immobilized and slowly strangled by its own logistical failures. On roads stretching from the Rhine to the Vistula, abandoned vehicles littered the landscape. Tanks sat idle at crossroads, their crews having siphoned the last drops of fuel before destroying them or simply walking away. Trucks were pushed into ditches, artillery pieces were spiked and left behind. These machines had not been defeated by enemy fire, they had been defeated by emptiness. Steel without fuel was useless, and Germany was running out of both. This crisis had been years in the making. Allied strategic bombing had systematically targeted synthetic fuel plants, rail hubs, and refineries. By mid-1944, production had fallen to a fraction of what the Wehrmacht required to sustain large-scale operations. What fuel remained was hoarded for emergencies, reserved for elite panzer formations that increasingly existed only in name. For ordinary infantry divisions, mobility was becoming a memory. As a result, German operational doctrine, once built around speed, flexibility, and decisive movement, collapsed. Counterattacks could no longer be launched on time, if at all. Withdrawals became perilous gambles, dependent on horse-drawn wagons or columns of exhausted men marching on foot. Entire formations were overtaken simply because they could not move fast enough to escape encirclement. On the Eastern Front, the contrast was brutal. Soviet armies advanced with overwhelming logistical support. Endless columns of trucks delivered fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements. Tanks were replaced almost as quickly as they were lost. Airfields sprang up close behind the front lines, allowing Soviet aircraft to dominate the skies. For German soldiers watching this advance, the imbalance was unmistakable and demoralizing. Commanders at the front sent increasingly desperate reports to Berlin. They spoke of units reduced to skeleton strength, of weapons without ammunition, of vehicles immobilized for lack of fuel. These reports were often ignored or dismissed as defeatist. The official narrative insisted that the situation was under control, that the enemy was overstretched, that a reversal was still possible. But the men fighting the war knew better. They could see the reality in the empty fuel cans, the silent engines, and the endless retreat. Morale suffered not because soldiers were unwilling to fight, but because they were being asked to fight without the means to do so. Courage could not replace gasoline, discipline could not move tanks. The logistical breakdown affected every aspect of combat. Artillery, once the backbone of German defensive fighting, was increasingly rationed. Guns fired only at critical moments, saving shells for when enemy breakthroughs seemed imminent. Infantry units relied more heavily on small arms and anti-tank weapons, forcing them into dangerously close engagements with enemy armor. Meanwhile, the Western Front presented its own grim challenges. After the Allied breakout from Normandy and the liberation of Paris, German forces fell back toward their own borders. Here too, fuel shortages crippled any attempt at coordinated defense. The Allies, supplied through vast ports and protected by total air superiority, advanced methodically. German units could delay them but never stop them. Perhaps most damaging was the psychological toll. Soldiers began to feel that they were fighting a war already decided by factors beyond their control. They held villages and forests not because they believed in victory, but because retreat meant court-martial or worse. The sense of agency that had once characterized German operations was gone, replaced by grim obedience and fatalism, and still the high command searched for solutions. If fuel was scarce, then units would fight without it. If divisions were depleted, then new formations would be created from what remained. Improvisation became policy. Rational planning gave way to desperate experimentation. It was in this context that Germany began reorganizing its ground forces, yet again attempting to build an army that could fight effectively despite catastrophic shortages. The solution, at least on paper, seemed bold: smaller divisions, fewer vehicles, more firepower concentrated at close range. A force designed not to maneuver, but to resist. Yet beneath this reorganization lay an uncomfortable truth. No matter how cleverly units were restructured, no matter how innovative the weapons issued to them, they would still be facing enemies with overwhelming material superiority. The question was not whether these new formations could fight, but whether they could meaningfully change the outcome. As winter deepened and the fronts continued to collapse, Germany stood at a crossroads of its own making. One path led to continued attrition, defensive withdrawals, and eventual defeat. The other led to something far more dangerous: a final, all-or-nothing gamble that would consume what little strength remained. The fuel was gone, the reserves were gone, and yet, the most reckless decision of the war was still to come. By the autumn of 1944, the German army no longer resembled the force that had once swept across Europe. Years of attrition had hollowed it out, stripping away experienced officers, veteran non-commissioned leaders, and the logistical backbone that sustained modern warfare. Faced with mounting losses and shrinking manpower pools, Adolf Hitler authorized a sweeping reorganization, one born not of strategic clarity, but of desperation. The result was the creation of the Volksgrenadier divisions. On paper, they represented a bold adaptation to Germany's dire circumstances. In reality, they were a measure of how far the Reich had fallen. These new formations were designed to do more with less. Traditional infantry divisions were dismantled and rebuilt into smaller, leaner units. Manpower was reduced, heavy equipment was cut back. Mobility, already crippled by fuel shortages, was largely abandoned. Instead, the Volksgrenadiers would rely on concentrated short-range firepower, defensive terrain, and sheer determination to blunt enemy advances. To support this concept, the German army issued large numbers of automatic weapons. Submachine guns, light machine guns, and anti-tank launchers became the backbone of these units. Where available, the revolutionary Sturmgewehr 44, the world's first true assault rifle, was distributed to frontline troops, offering unprecedented firepower at close range. In forests, towns, and narrow defensive positions, this could be devastating. But equipment alone could not solve the deeper problem. The composition of the Volksgrenadier divisions revealed the state of the Reich's manpower crisis. Their ranks were filled with a troubling mix: battle-hardened veterans pulled from shattered formations, older men recalled from civilian life, teenage conscripts barely finished with school, and surplus personnel transferred from the Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine, men trained for entirely different forms of warfare. Many had never fired their weapons before reaching the front. Training was rushed or non-existent. Units were formed, equipped, and deployed in a matter of weeks. Officers struggled to weld these disparate elements into cohesive fighting forces. Discipline varied wildly. Some companies performed with grim efficiency, while others collapsed at the first serious engagement. The Volksgrenadiers were not a unified army, they were an improvisation. And yet, in certain conditions, they fought remarkably well. In defensive terrain, wooded hills, villages, narrow valleys, Volksgrenadier units could be formidable. Ambush tactics, close-range firepower, and knowledge of the ground allowed some divisions to inflict heavy casualties on advancing Allied forces. On several occasions, American and British troops were shocked by the intensity of resistance they encountered from units they had expected to brush aside. These moments of effectiveness, however, masked a fatal flaw: the Volksgrenadiers lacked depth. Once losses were taken, there were no trained reserves to replace them. Once ammunition was expended, resupply was uncertain or impossible. Once morale cracked, there was little holding these fragile formations together. German commanders understood this. They knew that these divisions were not instruments of victory, but tools of delay. Their purpose was to buy time, to slow the enemy long enough for some undefined reversal to occur. What that reversal might be, no one could clearly explain. Despite these limitations, Volksgrenadier divisions were thrown into combat almost immediately. Some were deployed along the West Wall, Germany's defensive line facing the Allies. Others were held back for a far more ambitious operation already taking shape in Hitler's mind. It was here that the tragic contradiction of the Volksgrenadiers became clear. They were designed for defense, yet they would soon be asked to support an offensive. They were built to conserve manpower, yet they would be committed to battles that consumed men at an alarming rate. They were meant to stabilize a collapsing front, yet they would be hurled into one final gamble. If you're finding this deep dive into late war Germany gripping, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel reach more viewers who appreciate serious, well-researched history told in an engaging way. Among the rank and file, awareness of the broader situation was growing. Soldiers spoke quietly of encirclement, of inevitable defeat, of a war that no longer made sense. Letters home became guarded, often censored, but the tone shifted from confidence to resignation. The Volksgrenadiers were not blind. They could see the overwhelming strength arrayed against them. Still, many fought on with grim determination. Not for ideology, and often not even for victory, but for the men beside them. Unit cohesion, fragile as it was, became a lifeline. In foxholes and ruined villages, survival depended less on grand strategy than on mutual trust and discipline under fire. As winter approached, these divisions were moved into position. Supplies were stockpiled where possible, ammunition was counted carefully. Orders were sealed and distributed only at the last moment. Even many senior officers were kept in the dark about what was coming next. What they did know was this: Germany was preparing to strike, not because it was strong, but because it had nothing left to lose. And when the order finally came, the Volksgrenadiers would march not into a defensive stand, but into the Reich's final, catastrophic gamble. In December 1944, with Germany's strategic position beyond recovery, Adolf Hitler chose escalation over acceptance. Against the advice of many senior commanders, he authorized a massive offensive in the West, one that would consume the last reserves of men, fuel, and equipment the Reich possessed. It was a decision driven not by military logic, but by defiance and illusion. The target was the Ardennes forest. Hitler believed that a sudden, concentrated strike through the thinly held Allied lines in Belgium and Luxembourg could split the Anglo-American armies in two. If German forces could cross the Meuse River, seize Antwerp, and sever Allied supply lines, he hoped the Western Allies would be forced into negotiations allowing Germany to turn its full attention eastward against the Soviets. On paper, it was bold. In reality, it was catastrophic. Nearly every remaining mobile unit was committed to the offensive. The 5th Panzer Army, the 6th SS Panzer Army, and elements of the 7th Army were assembled for the attack. Volksgrenadier divisions formed the backbone of the infantry, tasked with infiltrating Allied lines, seizing key road junctions, and holding the flanks open for armored thrusts. Fuel was stockpiled in secret. Orders were issued under strict radio silence. On the morning of December 16, 1944, German artillery shattered the quiet of the Ardennes. Under cover of fog and snow, infantry surged forward. For the first time in months, German troops achieved operational surprise. American units, many of them inexperienced, were caught off guard. Positions were overrun, roads clogged with retreating vehicles and refugees. A deep bulge formed in the Allied front. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as though Hitler's gamble might succeed. But the weaknesses that had plagued Germany all year quickly resurfaced. The Ardennes narrow roads became choke points. Traffic jams slowed armored columns to a crawl. Fuel shortages returned with a vengeance. German units were forced to detour in search of Allied fuel depots, turning operational plans into improvised scavenger hunts. Meanwhile, American resistance stiffened. At critical road junctions, places like Bastogne, Allied forces held fast. Volksgrenadier units launched repeated assaults, often with courage and determination, but without sufficient artillery support or air cover. Losses mounted rapidly. Time, the one thing Germany could not afford to lose, slipped away. Then the weather changed. As the skies cleared, Allied air power returned in overwhelming force. Fighter bombers roamed freely over the battlefield, striking German columns trapped on exposed roads. Tanks were destroyed in long lines. Supply trucks were incinerated. The Luftwaffe, nearly non-existent by this stage of the war, could do little to intervene the offensive ground to a halt. By early January 1945, it was clear that the Ardennes attack had failed. German forces began withdrawing, abandoning equipment they could no longer move. The losses were devastating and irreplaceable. Thousands of experienced soldiers were killed or captured. The last operational reserves of fuel were gone. Germany's ability to conduct large-scale offensive operations died in the snow-covered forests of Belgium. For the Volksgrenadier divisions, the cost was especially severe. Many were shattered beyond recovery. Others retreated in fragments, merging with remnants of other units. The fragile structure that had held them together dissolved under sustained pressure. What remained of these divisions would be used only for defensive fighting, delaying actions on the road to Berlin. The psychological impact was just as damaging. Any lingering belief in a negotiated peace with the West evaporated. The Allies pressed forward with renewed confidence, while in the East, the Red Army prepared for its final, crushing offensives. Germany now faced annihilation from both directions, with no reserves left to deploy. Inside the Reich, the consequences were immediate. Cities were bombed without respite. Refugees flooded the roads. Civil administration broke down. The war that had once been fought in distant lands now consumed Germany itself. And still, Hitler refused to concede defeat, issuing orders that bore no relation to the reality on the ground. By the time Soviet forces crossed the Oder in January 1945, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Ardennes had been Germany's last chance, however realistic, to alter the course of the war. Its failure marked the final exhaustion of the Reich's military power. What followed was not a campaign, but a collapse. German soldiers continued to fight, often with grim professionalism, but now only to delay the inevitable. The Volksgrenadiers, the Panzer remnants, the battered infantry division Zoll were swept up in the final destruction of the Third Reich. Berlin lay ahead. Defeat was certain. And yet, even in these final months, the human cost continued to rise, paid not by those who made the decisions, but by those who carried them out.